I'm Dr. Cathy Bush.
And hello, I'm Dr. Tara Peters, and we are the Leadership Doctors. And today we have a really awesome thought leader with us today as a part of our Lessons from Leaders series. We have Jim Kouzes, who is with us today. We're excited to talk to him about a wide-ranging area of topics around leadership. So welcome, Jim.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you very much. And thank you, Cathy, for the opportunity to chat with you about your new book and our work as well.
Well, we're elated to have you with us during this time. And so we really are looking forward to the conversation along with our audience. So we think it would be a great place for us to start, Jim, in terms of you just sharing with us about your leadership journey, this path, this work that you've done with your partner, Barry Posner, but also to giving us a sense of the current kind of work that you have going on as well.
Absolutely. Be delighted to do that. You know, Tara, I grew up in the Washington, D.C. suburbs, Fairfax, Alexandria, Arlington, Virginia. My dad was a civil servant after World War II. My mom, a homemaker, like most during that era, but volunteered a lot for United Nations Association and other charities. And so I grew up in a very active, community-minded, civic-minded household that believed very much in service. And so one of the ways in which I lived that out was I was a Boy Scout. I was a Boy Scout, became an Eagle Scout, and as a result of that, got to serve in John F. Kennedy's Honor Guard. And that, I believe, was the moment I realized I was really fascinated with leadership. Here I was standing in front of the reviewing stand with President John F. Kennedy up above me with his family and the parade going by. And I was standing there watching all this happening. And it was just at that moment, I think something happened to me, particularly hearing him say, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. So I joined the Peace Corps after university and to live that out. One of the things that he started in his administration in order to help Americans provide some service overseas. And that was the first opportunity for me to be a teacher. And so as a teacher, then I thought I was going to go into the Foreign Service and be an ambassador. That was my aspiration at the time. But I decided when I came back to the United States, I wanted to get involved in education. And I did. And they wouldn't let me teach school because I didn't have a teaching credential. But I had been teaching for a couple of years in the Peace Corps. So I wanted to put that to use, and I got a job teaching adults instead of teaching kids in school. They let you teach adults without a certificate, but you can't teach kids. So I worked for Community Program Training Institute, and that was my first introduction to behavioral science training, communication skills, team building skills, presentation skills, interpersonal communication skills, all of those things that are the necessary for leadership, obviously, and for people to work well together in organizations. That led me to San Jose State University, where I directed a center there, and then to Santa Clara University, where I met my co-author, Barry Posner. And we teamed up together in 1982, late 81, the school year of 82, late 81, the fall and into 82. And found that we had some common interests in values initially, and then corporate culture. And then as we got into that, explored it more, we wanted to know what leaders did in order to build corporate cultures, and what do they do themselves to become the best leaders they could be. At the time, you may recall, back in the early 80s, Tom Peters and Bob Waterman written a book in 83 called In Search of Excellence. And people were focused on excellent companies. But we had this idea you didn't need to be in an excellent company to be an excellent leader. If you looked at history, you would know that there are a lot of excellent leaders who emerged during times where organizations were awful, or the climate, the conditions in which they were socially engaged were not very excellent. And so we said, why don't we take a look at what leaders do to become excellent, even if the company or the organization itself isn't. And that was the beginning of the first edition of the Leadership Challenge, which came out in '87. So that's a little 5-minute flyover of how I got to where I am today.
Well, Jim, I appreciate so much the work you've done, and the Leadership Challenge. I have the 6th edition here, has been a really pivotal way of looking at leadership that has influenced many, many people, including myself. And so I remember when the work was first new, I was also entering my first role as a leader. And so a little bit later, a couple of years after you released the first edition, and thinking about all of the work that you have done in your career, I can see the spirit of servant leadership, certainly in the book and what you believe in, and what you said about kind of what inspired you to think about what leadership really was. And so that's had a huge influence on me. And so again, really, really grateful for the work that you and your partner, Barry Posner, have done. So Jim, just thinking about what's going on in the world today, and of course, who could have predicted this pandemic, the kind of social unrest that we're experiencing these days, and a lot of the kinds of challenges that people are dealing with right now as they want to serve as leaders. They want to do their very best to have a great organizational culture and to have a lot of positive energy. So if you could help us think a little bit about the kinds of conversations you're having with people, we can focus in specifically on this great change in what work looked like associated with the pandemic. It would be, I think, helpful for our audience to think about, what big picture ideas maybe that they're not thinking about that they could be to help them make the most of this odd period of time.
Well, Cathy, thank you for that question. One of the things that, and when you study leadership as long as we have, you, Tara, I, Barry, one of the things that you realize is we've been through a lot of change over a 40-year period of time, practically, when Barry and I first started writing and researching together. The context has changed a lot. When Barry and I first wrote the first edition of Leadership Challenge, there wasn't a computer program that would allow us to share files. We didn't have that. Then the second book we wrote, there was Kermit, and we were able to use a computer to share files when he was in Australia and I was in Santa Clara, California. And look at us now. We're doing this conference call over Zoom, and we're doing video conferencing, as are practically everyone else is working from home now. And so the context in which people are leading, and that's just one example, has changed dramatically. But the content of leadership hasn't changed that much at all. What we see is a deeper understanding of the practices that make for exemplary leadership, but the basic fundamentals haven't changed all that significantly. And so I think we've learned a lot in that period of time about what works and what doesn't. And if you take the current context and the question you asked about what people are talking about, of course, the big question is, how do I lead in adverse, uncertain times? Right now we have the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement, and people are wondering, when will this end? When will either one end? What's going to happen next? When are we going to get back to a new normal? Well, those are huge questions that none of us have the answers to right now. But as we learn more about what's needed in times like this, then we can help people to be more responsive. If you can't decide exactly where you're headed, does that mean you should not be thinking about the future? In fact, one of the things when I talk to leaders about that particular issue of not knowing is how important it is, even more important in times of uncertainty, to have a clear direction and a clear sense of purpose and meaning, so that people, even though some of the usual things that people are used to aren't there anymore, they still have a sense that they're doing something that's meaningful and important, and that there's a purpose to all of it. So meaning and purpose is a big part of our conversations right now. And it's challenging for people to be able to imagine it, but one of the things that's important in times like this is what's called in the research temporal distancing. In other words, you have to create some distance from the current situation, at least mentally and emotionally, in order to be able to get through it. If I am just stuck in feeling alone and isolated and potentially depressed and like life, my life is all a mess, and what's going to happen to my kids in school, and you get all immersed in that, that's when people get mentally ill. And so we have to be able to remove ourselves, find ways to do that. And one of the ways is temporal distancing. So we ask people to think about, just as one example, when this is over, and it will be over, then there'll be a different landscape that we're going to be looking at, and different ways of working. And there are great opportunities there to be innovative and creative. When we're into another way of working, learning from the lessons from this time, what do you want that to look like? And as you look back on the pandemic or the Black Lives Matter movement, and you're talking about how you behaved during that time, how did you behave? How did you react? What were you doing? And how are you seeing the world in the future, and how are you behaving right now? And is that helping you get to where you want to go? And so creating that kind of perspective on things is one very important conversation that we are having, as well as being clear about meaning and purpose, and then taking charge, doing something, taking initiative to make something happen in small little increments. We're not going to change a lot of what we're doing overnight, but we can get a lot better at Zoom meetings. So how can we make those little kinds of improvements that will help us feel like we're making some progress in working remotely, for example? So those are just a couple of illustrations of the kinds of conversations we've had.
So, Jim, as you were talking, I mean, a lot of things were running through my head. And one of the things that I was thinking about the most was the point that you made around how the key elements of really leading have not changed. They remain relatively constant despite these contextual changes that have taken place over the last 40 years. And so, of course, this has been a really important part of your work that you and Barry have done around the 5 practices. And so maybe just kind of in this moment for our viewers who maybe are less familiar with your work, maybe talk about that, and then what you see out of those 5 practices that you believe is really essential at this moment in time, that as leaders are, again, preparing for what is next as a part of the current context, what you would be emphasizing to them.
Oh, thanks, Tara. So when Barry and I got together back in the 80s and we were looking at leadership and personal best leadership, we asked the question, what do you do when you're at your best as a leader? And we came up with the framework with that context. We weren't asking about organizations, and we weren't asking about other leaders, what other leaders do. We asked people to think about what they did. After collecting thousands of cases and then putting that through the usual psychometrics that you have to go through in order to validate a model, we came up with 5 practices of exemplary leadership. The first of those is model the way. So people need to be clear about values and beliefs. They have to find their voice to express those, find a way to create a sense of shared values and beliefs, a shared identity, and then to be able to set an example by living those out in the daily life as a leader, at work, at home, wherever you might be leading. And then the second practice is we call inspire a shared vision. To inspire a shared vision, one needs to be clear personally about where you want to be headed in the future. You're being forward-looking, looking out 5, 10 or more years, asking yourself, what will the world look like? As well as then enlisting other people in that vision of the future so that there is a shared vision. So like shared values, there's a shared understanding of the long term as well. In order to get to that future, you probably can't do things exactly the way you're now doing them. So people told us that when they were at their personal best, they had to challenge the process, the third of our 5 practices. search for opportunities to change, innovate, and improve towards that vision of the future, and then to experiment and take risks and learn from the mistakes. So let's try something. If it doesn't work, we'll learn from it, try something again. We'll iterate until we have developed a new way of doing our work. And then we'll challenge ourselves some more. But we can't do it alone. So we have to enable others to act. We need to make sure that we strengthen collaboration, that we foster collaboration, trust, and build teams. And then we also have to strengthen individuals' capacity to do the work. If we're doing something new and different, people may not have the skills. How do we develop those skills? How do we help them become autonomous decision makers so that they can follow the values and implement them on their own without when the leader isn't around or other team members aren't around? And then we need to encourage the heart, because getting to that new vision of the future is challenging and difficult. And so people need some individual recognition in order to be able to pursue that, as well as to celebrate together as a team. So the 5 practices of exemplary leadership that emerge from our personal best leadership studies are: model the way, inspire a shared vision, challenge the process, enable others to act, and encourage the heart.
Oh, thank you for that overview. And for those folks who, want to dig in a little bit more, one of the things I really like about your book is that it speaks in a lot of different places to specific actions that a person can take. So not just the actions that they can immediately take, but also the developmental actions that they can take to improve in these 5 practice areas. And that's, as Tara and I were working on our book, The Demotivated Employee, we also were really interested in speaking to leaders about actions that they can take to help people. In particular, the focus of our book, as you know, is about seeing a person who was highly motivated then begins to lose motivation, and then speaking to the leaders about what you can do to prevent that from happening or to reverse that if you see that happening. And so as I was listening to you talk about those 5 behaviors, and I think in particular the last 2 of the behaviors, enabling others to act and encouraging the heart, I think there's a lot of overlap in terms of this idea of employee engagement and what we can do as leaders to help maintain engagement, prevent employee demotivation. So again, we're just interested in hearing your thoughts about that as a problem. I'm sure you know, and you've seen the studies from Gallup, like 70% of people are disengaged at work, which is so tragic. So how can we help leaders who are dealing with this issue, who care about this issue, and who want to see that trend reverse and help their people stay motivated?
Well, one of the things, Cathy, that we have found in our research is it's a matter of frequency. People may already be leading, but particularly during times of crisis and adversity, they have to do everything much more frequently than they are currently doing. We find, for example, I'll just give you a couple of behaviors associated with a couple of the practices so you have a sense of what the impact is. When leaders infrequently talk about values and beliefs, a philosophy of leading, the way we're going to do things in this organization. When they infrequently do that, only 3% of people are engaged in work. But when they do it very frequently, or almost always, 92% of people are engaged in their work. That's just one of the behaviors associated with model the way. If I take another behavior associated with inspire a shared vision, showing other people that their long-term interests, their vision of the future, can be realized by enlisting in a common vision. Infrequently done, only 7% of people are engaged, whereas very frequently or almost always 98% of people are engaged. So you can just see from those 2 examples, and we have data on every behavior you can imagine associated with each of these practices, that the more frequently you engage in them, the more likely it is people will have positive work attitudes. They'll trust more. They'll feel like there's more meaning in work. They feel like they are personally being more productive. They will feel like they are making a difference in the world. All of those things that are measured in engagement go up the more frequently leader demonstrates behavior. So the most important lesson that we have learned from our research on leadership is it's a matter of frequency. You can't just articulate a vision every now and then and expect people to be on board. You have to do it a lot, particularly when people are uncertain. You can't just say, oh, here is our values, and we post them on the wall in the hall or put them in the manual that people get when they are recruited to join the organization, and then forget about them. They have to be daily reminders of what should guide us in making decisions so that we are consistent between what we say and what we do. And so for each of these practices, what we find is the more frequently engage in the behaviors associated with the practice, the more likely it is that people will be engaged in their work and have more positive work attitudes.
Well, Jim, there's so much utility in what you've shared there around how often we do things actually matters. We have data that helps to support why people should behave and do things a certain way. And so, of course, we know that you have your tagline, love them and lead them. We know there's a great story behind that. It'd be great if you are inclined to maybe share a little bit of that as we kind of wrap up, because one of the things that we think is important is to really help those who are in a leadership role or maybe imagining themselves being in a leadership role at some point in the future, to figure out what are the kinds of things that they can be doing to grow and to develop themselves so that when the opportunity presents itself, they're actually prepared to step into that role. And so we'd love to hear your insight and perspective.
Well, two things, a couple of questions there. One has to do with the tagline, love them and lead them, and I'd love to tell that story. But I'll save that till I answer one of your other questions, which really had to do with learning leadership. And a couple of things to tee that up. When we look at whether or not people can learn to lead, what we find is that the good news is there's only, and I'm going to give you an actual statistic here, 0.00013% of people who have no leadership capacity whatsoever. So when we take a look at all of our data, and we've got 5 million people in our database, we analyze about 1 million a year, we find that of those total population of those people that we've studied, and these are workplace professionals, 0.00013%. That's 1 in 1 million people have no leadership capacity. So the good news is that you have that capability. Leadership is a set of skills and abilities that people can learn. Now, here's the other flip side of that. It's a little bit higher percentage, but not that much more, about 1% of people who do it at the most extreme, excellent level. And so we've got work to do to close that gap. So while all of us have the capability, not all of us are engaging in these behaviors. That's why we see engagement levels so low, is because people aren't doing these behaviors frequently enough. So again, going back to the earlier lesson, do all of this more frequently. But you can also help yourself to learn to lead by doing a couple of other things. First of all, you got to believe you can. That may sound so simple, but time after time after time, people are wondering, well, is leadership born or made? Can I learn these skills, or is it just something that's innate? Or you have the good fortune of growing up in the right household, or you went to the right school, or all of those demographic kinds of variables. And you know what? They account for less than 1% of why people are excellent at leadership, all those demographics. What counts is your behavior. So first of all, know that you can lead, believe you can. You have to have aspirational goals for yourself as a leader. Where you are today as a leader is not, hopefully, where you can be a year from now or 2 years from now if you apply yourself So continuous learning requires aspirational goals for yourself, not just for the organization, but for yourself. You have to challenge yourself. The learning edge is at the edge of what you already know. So if you already know how to do something, you got to challenge yourself to move beyond that. And then you need to ask other people for help because you can't do it alone. So you have to engage support of others. Find yourself a board of directors for yourself to help you, mentor you, coach you, counsel you in order to learn how to lead. And lastly, you got to practice deliberately. There's an interesting study done by Josh Bersin with LinkedIn that found something that's consistent with what Barry Posner and I found in our research on learning. That is that the best leaders are the best learners, and that they found that leaders who engage for 5 or more hours per week in learning, compared to those who spend less than an hour a week in learning, know more about where they want to go in their careers, are more satisfied, are happier with their lives and with their work, and are less stressed. So engaging in more learning opportunities and practicing all of these skills and abilities more frequently will help you to know more about what you want to do with your life and your career, be more satisfied with the direction in which it's going, and feel less stress in your life. So believe you can, set some aspirational goals for yourself, challenge yourself, engage support of others, and then put all this into practice on a daily basis.
Okay, so I'm still waiting to hear the love 'em and lead 'em's part of the story, Jim. That was a good tease for us. Are you ready to tell us?
I'll be glad to tell you. So you all may already know, but the person who inspired us with this love 'em and lead 'em story was Major General John Stanford. John was at Military Traffic Management Command when we first met him here in Alameda County in California, and then he moved on to be head of Fulton County, county administrator, Fulton County, which is where Atlanta is located. And then he moved on to be Seattle Unified School District superintendent. So he led a very distinguished public service career before he sadly passed away a few years ago. And John, when we were talking to him and closing the interview, I asked John, so tell me, what would you advise other people to do if they wanted to learn to lead, become better at leading? And he said, well, I tell them that I have the secret to success in life. Whenever one asks me that question, I tell them I have the secret to success in life. The secret to success is to stay in love. Staying in love gives you the fire to really ignite other people, to see inside other people, to have a greater desire to get things done than other people. A person who is not in love doesn't feel the kind of excitement that helps them to get ahead and lead others and to achieve. I don't know any other fire, any other thing in life that is more positive and exhilarating a feeling than love is. Now, I did not expect to hear that from a major general in the Army, but then when I thought about John and all of the other people that we had interviewed, it was clear that they were in love with the work that they were doing, the people who were doing the work, the clients and other constituents who were using their organization's services. And they were also in love with leading. And so if we want to improve ourselves and become the best leaders that we can be, we need to love them and lead them.
Well, Jim, such great words of inspiration and just a wonderful way to wrap up our interview today. Cathy and I, again, are so grateful for you being with us today to be a part of our Lessons from Leaders. We're also eternally grateful to you for the endorsement of our book. So thank you so much, Jim, for being with us today.
It's my pleasure. And thank you, Tara, and thank you, Cathy.
Thank you, Jim. And, for folks who heard him in the last part of this interview mention 5 hours a week or more invested in your learning. I just want to remind you, in addition to reading some great books, and we've been talking about some today, there are other things you can do to develop your leadership skills. We've offered several of these lessons from leaders videos and other things on our website. There's so many resources like this from a lot of folks who are interested in serving you and helping you serve the people that you lead. And so if you're interested in checking out any more lessons from leaders, interviews, or other items on our website, it's at theleadershipdoctors.com. Thanks again.